Sometime around 1930, on a stretch of Coney Island boardwalk, packed with barkers and freak show tents, a man weighing roughly 150 pounds is said to have lifted more than 3,000 pounds off the ground using nothing but his back. 80 years later, that same man was still walking the streets of Brooklyn every single morning, and he was 104 years old. Those two sentences describe the same person, and once you sit with that for a second, the whole thing starts to feel slightly impossible. Joe Rollino belongs to a world of gas lamps, dime museums, and mail-order muscle courses, a world that should have closed over him decades ago. Instead, he kept walking straight out the other side of it, into an age of cell phones and internet forums, still lacing up his shoes for a 5-mile stroll. And almost nobody outside of Brooklyn ever knew his name. So this is really two questions stacked on top of each other. Were the feats real, or were they boardwalk numbers inflated by a hungry press and a good storyteller? And if even half of them were real, how did a man like that manage to stay invisible, while other strongmen of his exact era became household names? Let's start where he started. Joseph Rollino was born in Brooklyn in 1905 to Italian immigrant parents in a household that by most accounts held around 14 children. That detail alone tells you a lot about the economics of the situation. There was no allowance, no gym membership, no protein powder, and no career path in physical culture that didn't involve performing for strangers. If a kid in that neighborhood was unusually strong, the strength wasn't a hobby, it was inventory. And Rollino was unusually strong in a way that made no visual sense. He never got big. Across his entire life, he seems to have hovered somewhere between 150 and 160 pounds, standing about 5'5". He was not a mountain of a man. He was, by every description that survives, a compact, dense, unremarkable-looking Italian guy who could do things to heavy objects that larger men could not. Now, to understand what he walked into, you have to understand Coney Island in the 1920s. This was the absolute peak of American physical culture as public entertainment. Not sport, entertainment. Strength was something you sold tickets to, alongside sword swallowers and fire eaters, and the guy who claimed to be from a lost civilization. The boardwalk was thick with strongman acts, and the audience wanted to be amazed rather than convinced. Nobody was checking the plates. The king of that particular hill was a man named Warren Lincoln Travis. Born in 1876, Travis was Coney Island's dominant strength performer for decades, and he was the acknowledged master of one very specific and very strange lift. He held the Richard K. Fox Strongman belt, which in that era functioned as something close to a world title, awarded by the sporting press rather than any governing body, because governing bodies for this sort of thing barely existed yet. Travis specialized in the backlift, and the backlift deserves an explanation, because it's the feat that anchors this entire story. Here's how it works. The lifter positions himself under a heavy platform, braced with his hands on a support, and straightens his hips and legs just enough to break the platform free of its stands. The range of motion is tiny, sometimes an inch or less. The leverage is enormous. It is a genuine test of raw structural strength through the hips, spine, and legs, and it is also, in terms of pure poundage, the single most flattering lift ever devised. That's not a knock on it. It's just important context. A backlift number and a deadlift number are not the same species of number, and anybody who tells you otherwise is selling something. Travis was reportedly handling well over 3,000 pounds in this style, and he built an entire career on it. He was still performing into the 1930s, and he died in 1941, which more or less closes the book on that particular flavor of American strongman showmanship. Young Joe Rollino came up inside that world, in Travis's orbit, on that boardwalk, in that decade, and the numbers attached to him are genuinely absurd. The figure that follows him everywhere is a back lift of around 3,200 pounds. Then there's a single finger lift of 635 pounds, which is exactly what it sounds like. A weight raised off the ground with one finger hooked through a ring or handle, and then there's 475 pounds lifted with his teeth. Let's just sit with the teeth one for a moment because it's the detail that tends to break people. 475 pounds, with his jaw, through a leather strap, or a bit clamped between his molars. That is roughly the weight of a full-grown grizzly bear, held by the same equipment most of us use to chew a bagel badly. The teeth lift was a legitimate old-school specialty performed by several strongmen of the period, but the numbers Rollino is credited with sit at the extreme upper end of anything ever claimed. He also reportedly bent quarters with his fingers and snapped them in half with his teeth. Not pennies, not soft modern coins, 1920s, silver quarters. If you have ever tried to bend a coin, you know that this is the sort of thing that sounds like a small feat until you actually attempt it, at which point it becomes deeply humbling. So the question is obvious. Are any of these numbers real? And here is where honesty matters more than hype. Almost none of Rollino's feats were performed under anything resembling sanctioned conditions. There were no judges, no certified plates, no federation records, no film crew documenting the loading of the platform. What exists are newspaper accounts, later interviews, and Rollino's own retellings across a very long life. Those retellings were remarkably consistent, which counts for something. But consistency is not the same thing as verification. It's also worth being clear about what the era was like. Strongman claims in the 1920s and 1930s were marketing. Performers routinely inflated body weight of the objects lifted, used hollow globes, misreported their own weight, and competed with each other in print rather than in person. This wasn't fraud exactly. It was show business, and everyone in the audience half knew it, but that doesn't mean the verdict is simply that he made it all up. The backlift number, for instance, is entirely plausible for a trained specialist in that era, because Travis and others were documented handling comparable loads with the same apparatus and the same tiny range of motion. Whether Rollino specifically hit 3,200 pounds on a given afternoon is unknowable. Whether a wiry 150-pound man could break several thousand pounds off the stands with a well-built platform and years of practice is not really in dispute. Leverage is a wonderful thing. The finger and teeth lifts sit in murkier territory, and honest researchers should say so. My read is that the feats happened, that Rollino performed them regularly and publicly for years, and that the exact poundages drifted upward, the way boardwalk poundages always did. He was doing something extraordinary. The decimal points just aren't trustworthy. There's another thread running through his early years that most tellings skip past too quickly. Before and alongside the strongman work, Rollino boxed professionally under the ring name Kid Dundee. Documentation on that career is thin, and I could not find a clean, verifiable fight record, so treat the details lightly. But the fact of it fits the pattern perfectly, because this is what strength actually looked like as a livelihood in that era. You did not pick one discipline and specialize. You boxed for purses, you performed on the boardwalk for coins and tickets, you took whatever demonstration work came along, and you stitched a living together out of your own body. There was no other model available. The idea of a professional strength athlete supported by sponsorship or competition prize money simply did not exist yet, which brings us to the most interesting comparison in the whole story, and the real answer to why you've probably never heard of Joe Rollino. A few miles away, another Italian immigrant kid from Brooklyn was working the same territory. His name was Angelo Siciliano, and by the mid-1920s, he had rebranded himself as Charles Atlas. Reports place the two men as acquaintances, which is entirely believable given how small that community was. Same borough, same era, same rough starting point. But Atlas did one thing Rollino never did. He sold the idea. Atlas partnered with an advertising man named Charles Roman, packaged his training method as dynamic tension, and put it into mail order courses backed by some of the most effective advertising copy of the 20th century. The skinny kid, the bully, the kick sand, the transformation. Those ads ran in comic books and magazines for generations. Atlas never had to lift 3,000 pounds off a boardwalk platform because he was selling something far more scalable than a feat. He was selling the promise of becoming someone else. Rollino sold performances. Atlas sold aspiration. One of those things reaches 10 million people who will never meet you. That is the entire difference, and it has nothing to do with who was stronger. Now here's where the story crosses out of its original era, and it needs to be marked clearly, because what follows belongs to a completely different chapter of American life. The Coney Island strongman world effectively ended with the Second World War. Travis was dead by 1941. The sideshow economy was collapsing. Barbell training was about to be professionalized by Bob Hoffman in York and then reinvented again by the Whiters, and physique competition was about to become its own separate sport with its own separate stars. Joe Rollino did not participate in any of that. He went to war. Rollino served in the Pacific Theater, and his record there is not a footnote. He came home with 3 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star, and a Bronze Star. Those are not decorations handed out for showing up. The Purple Hearts mean he was wounded 3 separate times and went back. The Silver Star means gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. And the accounts of what he actually did are almost hard to believe in the context of everything else. He is described as carrying multiple wounded men at once out of fire, using the exact same freakish structural strength he had been demonstrating for tips on a boardwalk a decade earlier. Think about what that means for a second. A man spends his 20s lifting platforms for the amusement of tourists eating hot dogs, and then in his late 30s, he uses that same body to carry bleeding men off a beach. The boardwalk stunts suddenly stop looking like stunts. They look like preparation. Nobody knew was preparation. That is the moment the whole story turns. After the war, he essentially disappeared into ordinary life. He worked, he lived in Brooklyn, he did not chase the spotlight, and the physical culture world moved on without him. The 1940s and 1950s belonged to men like John Grimick and Steve Reeves, competing in an organized bodybuilding scene with judges and titles and magazine coverage. That was a genuinely different sport with a genuinely different value system, and Rollino, who came from the platform and the boardwalk, had no obvious place in it. He just kept training, quietly, for decades, for no audience at all. And this is where the habits become the story, because they are the most verifiable thing about him, and arguably the most remarkable. Rollino did not drink. He did not smoke. He ate a diet that was largely free of meat, which in the physical culture world of that period was close to heresy, given that the entire industry was about to spend 40 years insisting that steak and milk were the foundation of all human strength. He was a member of the Coney Island Polar Bear Club, which means he swam in the Atlantic Ocean in the middle of winter, voluntarily, for fun, well past the age when most people consider a cold hallway a hardship. And he walked, every day, several miles, through Bay Ridge and the surrounding neighborhoods for the better part of a century. There is no supplement stack in that list. There is no periodization scheme. There is a man who found a set of habits early and simply never stopped, which is the least marketable and most effective training advice ever assembled. When he turned 100 in 2005, people started paying attention again. He gave interviews, he showed up at gyms and events. He was, by then, something close to a living artifact, a man who could talk about Warren Lincoln Travis and Coney Island in the 1920s from direct memory, at a time when everyone else who could do that had been gone for 50 years. He reportedly could still bend a coin at 100 years old. He liked to say that strength was mental before it was physical, that the body followed what the mind believed it could do. That's the sort of line that gets flattened into a motivational poster, and I'd normally roll my eyes at it. Coming from a man who had been continuously demonstrating it for 10 decades, it lands differently. And that is the genuinely strange sensation this story leaves you with. A man who trained alongside jazz-age sideshow strongmen, who fought in the Pacific, who watched the entire arc of modern bodybuilding rise and peak and commercialize, was still out there doing his morning walk in Brooklyn during the Obama administration. Every era of this sport that we cover, he was alive for. All of them. On January 11th, 2010, Joe Rollino was struck by a vehicle while crossing a street in Brooklyn during his usual morning walk. He died that day at the age of 104. There's no good way to make that land gently, and I'm not going to try. A man who survived 3 wounds in the Pacific who spent a century keeping his body in working order, was killed on an ordinary street on an ordinary morning, doing the ordinary thing he had done every day of his adult life. The universe does not do poetry, it does coincidence. And sometimes coincidence is cruel. So where does that leave the legend? The honest verdict is this. The 3,200-pound backlift is probably somewhat generous and entirely possible in principle. The 635-pound finger lift and the 475-pound teeth lift are unverifiable and likely inflated, though the feats themselves were unquestionably real and unquestionably rare. He was not the strongest man of his era in any measurable sense, and he never claimed a title that anyone recognized. But the feat that actually matters was never a single lift. It was 104 years of a body maintained by a man who simply refused to stop using it, from a Coney Island boardwalk in the 1920s to a Brooklyn sidewalk in 2010. That is not a number anyone had to exaggerate, and it is the one record from that entire era that nobody has come close to breaking. Charles Atlas sold millions of people the idea that they could change their bodies. Joe Rollino just spent a century proving it, on foot, in Brooklyn, where almost nobody was watching.